Imagine if the United Nations called an emergency meeting to solve a massive global crisis, right? But then there was literally a bouncer at the door charging a $1 billion cover charge just to get inside the room.
Oh man, yeah, $1 billion just for a seat at the table.
Exactly. And, I want to welcome you, the listener, to today's deep dive because that scenario isn't some plot from a dystopian novel. That is actually the geopolitical blueprint we are looking at for 2025 and
It
2026.
really is. It's happening right now.
Yeah, so today we are acting as your strategic briefing. We're tracking how decades of slow-moving, rules-based diplomacy they're being replaced by these corporate-style contracts, this whole pay-to-play coalition model.
Right. It is a monumental shift. I mean, we are watching this real-time transition from a world where international law is theoretically applied to everyone to a totally fragmented system. And it's driven almost entirely by the America First ideology.
And we aren't just talking about political rhetoric here, are we?
No, not at all. We are unpacking the actual cause and effect chains today, like how a pivot in Washington's institutional strategy instantly reconfigures global supply chains, or how it sparks, parallel financial systems.
Right, which forces allied nations to completely rewrite their own national security playbooks just to keep up.
Exactly. It changes everything from maritime security to rare earths dependency.
So to understand the mechanics of this aggressive new posture, we actually have to rewind a bit. We have to look at a 200-year-old policy that just got a massive modern reboot.
Ah, yes. The Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine. So back in 1823, Spanish colonial rule was collapsing across Latin America. And U.S. President James Monroe basically put a giant no trespassing sign on the lawn of the Western Hemisphere.
Which was, at the time, entirely a defensive posture.
Right. He was warning European powers, specifically the Holy Alliance, like, hey, the Americas are closed to recolonization. Do not come over here.
And that defensive origin is crucial context for you to keep in mind. Because fast forward to the 2025 National Security Strategy under the Trump administration, and they have officially resurrected that exact doctrine.
But it's not exactly a defensive shield against European monarchies anymore, is it?
Not even close. It has been reforged into this offensive geopolitical eviction notice, and this time it is directed squarely at China and Russia.
It's like dusting off a 200-year-old defensive shield and hammering it into an offensive sword. But, if Europe isn't the threat anymore, how does Washington justify pointing in 19th century doctrine at Beijing and Moscow?
Well, it all comes down to a hyper-focus on geoeconomics. That and immediate border security. The U.S. is looking at China's massive economic footprint in Latin America and getting very nervous.
Like their investments in infrastructure and telecom down there.
Exactly. Telecom, infrastructure, and critically, mineral extraction. The U.S. views all of that as a direct threat to American supply chains. We are talking about energy security, lithium deposits that are vital for future tech, things like that.
Wow. And then what about Russia's role in all this?
So simultaneously, Russia has really deepened its strategic and military engagements in places like Venezuela and Cuba.
Oh, right.
So this modernized Monroe Doctrine treats those economic and diplomatic ties not as, routine international relations. It treats them as hostile encroachments. The argument is that they exacerbate regional instability and consequently drive migration pressures right up to the U.S. southern border.
So it used to be about keeping foreign armies out, but now it's about keeping foreign capital and state-backed enterprises out. But let's look at the actual mechanism here. If I'm sitting in the Kremlin or the Chinese Politburo, does slapping a neo-hegemonic label on Latin America actually deter me?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, doesn't this posturing just escalate the security dilemma?
Well, the security dilemma is exactly the mechanism at play here. Supporters of this revival argue that clear, hardline signaling is literally the only way to establish deterrence in a multipolar world.
Like you draw a massive red line to prevent a miscalculation.
Right. But the reality of international relations is that defensive measures are almost always perceived as offensive by your adversaries.
Naturally.
Yeah, so when the U.S. applies these aggressive trade measures and sweeping sanctions to assert regional dominance, it inherently triggers a reaction. Target nations don't just back down. They double down on asymmetric strategies to bypass U.S. influence entirely.
Which perfectly brings us to the domestic engine driving this whole foreign policy shift. Because the revival of the Monroe Doctrine in 2025 doesn't just exist in a vacuum, right?
Right. It is deeply connected to domestic politics. It is the external wing of the Make America Great Again ideological framework.
The Mangier movement. We all know the domestic pillars, right? Strict border control, cultural conservatism, trying to bring manufacturing back home. But for our deep dive today, the mechanism that really matters is the deep structural skepticism of elite multilateral institutions.
Oh, absolutely. That skepticism is the fulcrum of the current global fragmentation we're seeing. The prevailing U.S. philosophy right now is that institutions like the UN and the WTO have actually constrained American power.
Right, the idea that the WTO hollowed out the American industrial base.
Exactly. So the strategic response to that is intense economic nationalism. The U.S. has systematically combined its military, economic, and diplomatic instruments into a highly unilateral toolkit.
So instead of relying on the dispute resolution mechanisms of the WTO, they just act on their own.
Yeah, we are seeing a profound reliance on unilateral tariffs, sweeping export controls, and secondary sanctions. It is a complete bypassing of the old rules.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second here. We can criticize the weaponization of tariffs and the abandonment of the WTO all day. But from a purely self-interested perspective, hasn't America First actually worked to protect certain domestic industries?
Well, it depends on your timeline.
I mean, if the U.S. possesses the world's largest consumer market and controls the reserve currency, why shouldn't they use that maximal leverage to secure their own supply chains, even if it completely upends traditional multilateralism?
I hear you. It is a high-risk, high-reward gamble. In the short term, yes, you can absolutely force concessions and protect specific domestic sectors.
But there's a catch.
A massive structural catch. The blowback mechanism is severe. When you weaponize the US dollar and global financial networks like SWIFT, you inadvertently incentivize the rest of the world to de-dollarize.
You basically force targeted countries to build parallel economic systems so they don't have to rely on you.
Exactly. Look at the geographical case studies for that exact phenomenon. The U.S. applied maximalist sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, right? And they threw their diplomatic weight behind recognizing Juan Guaido.
With the objective being regime change.
Right. But the actual mechanism of those sanctions just pushed Venezuela into a shadow economy. It actually deepened their reliance on Russia, China, and Iran to bypass U.S. financial coercion.
Wow, so it backfired strategically.
Yeah.
And we see a similar transactional approach in the Middle East, right?
Definitely. Traditional multilateral diplomacy would focus on comprehensive UN-backed peace processes. But the new toolkit bypassed that entirely. It focused on bilateral leverage.
Like relocating the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem.
Exactly. And brokering the Abraham Accords through localized economic and security incentives. Plus, utilizing unilateral military force, like the strikes on Iranian General Soleimani and Houthi targets.
The Abraham Accords are actually a perfect example of this shift. It is pure deal-based diplomacy. It essentially said, we will bypass the historical values-based UN framework regarding the Palestinian issue.
And instead, offer bilateral security guarantees.
Yeah, exactly. Security guarantees and economic partnerships if you normalize relations. I mean, it contained some immediate threats, but it left the underlying regional instability completely unaddressed.
Right, and we saw the exact same transactional friction in Europe. The primary diplomatic tool there was pressuring NATO allies for higher financial burden sharing.
Treating an established, decades-old security alliance more like a mafia protection pact.
Pretty much. And all of this culminates in a fragmented global order. When the hegemon withdraws its support for universal, rule-based norms in favor of bilateral deal-making, the multilateral system doesn't just pause, it begins to collapse.
Which leads us directly to the most staggering institutional shift we are tracking today. I mean, if you inherently distrust slow, consensus-based institutions like the United Nations, eventually you have to build a parallel alternative to manage global crises, right?
You do. And that is where the Board of Peace comes in.
The BOP.
The BOP is the purest crystallization of this new transactional era. Emerging in the 2025-2026 timeframe, it is a minilateral, highly centralized organization led by the U.S., with Donald Trump acting as its chairman.
And its initial stated objective is just immense. It's focused on coordinating the implementation of a Gaza ceasefire, funding post-war reconstruction, and managing the governance transition.
And the numbers attached to this framework are just wild.
They really are. Global reconstruction for Gaza is estimated at $70 billion. The U.S. has pledged up to $10 billion. But, the legal framework for joining this board is what fundamentally rewrites international relations for you and me.
Yes. To secure a permanent seat on the Board of Peace, meaning a long-term structural role in the decision-making process, a nation must pay an entry fee.
Of approximately $1 billion.
A $1 billion cover charge. It shifts global governance entirely away from the principle of sovereign equality.
Because In the UN General Assembly, theoretically at least, every nation has a voice regardless of its GDP.
Exactly. But the Board of Peace operates exactly like a corporate board of directors. If you provide the capital, you hold the equity, and you make the rules.
And if you cannot afford the $1 billion permanent seat,
Then you are relegated to a term-based membership. That lasts just 3 years. And its renewal is entirely at the discretion of the chairman and the permanent members.
So it's totally pay to play. And look at the roster of who actually bought in. Out of roughly 60 invited nations, only about 25 have signed on.
Right, you have Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Qatar, and Indonesia.
But the absences tell the real story of global fragmentation here. Major Western allies, like the UK, France, Germany, Canada, they are totally absent. And strategic adversaries like China and Russia are explicitly excluded.
Because the strategic intent behind the BAP is velocity. Multilateralism is slow. Getting 193 UN member states to agree on a reconstruction framework takes years.
Right, whereas a minilateral pay-to-play coalition of like-minded states can deploy capital and security forces rapidly.
Exactly. But the cost of that velocity is the total erosion of universal legitimacy. It normalizes a world where geopolitical outcomes are decided exclusively by the highest bidders in closed-door transactional arrangements.
So, okay, if the U.S. is bypassing traditional institutions, isolating Europe, and setting up exclusive corporate boards for regional crises, how exactly does it manage the biggest strategic rivalry on the planet?
You mean China?
Yeah. How does China fit into a world governed by deal-based minilateralism?
Well, the dynamic is officially characterized right now as managed competition.
Managed competition, got it.
Yeah. The U.S. recognizes that a full kinetic confrontation with China would be economically and militarily catastrophic for everyone. So the objective is limited stabilization.
Meaning they set up guardrails.
Right. Establishing high-level leader contacts and military-to-military crisis protocols. These are the guardrails meant to prevent, say, a misunderstanding in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait from spiraling into World War III.
But beneath those diplomatic guardrails, the economic warfare is fiercer than ever.
Oh, absolutely. We aren't seeing a complete decoupling of the two economies because that's practically impossible, but we are witnessing a massive forced reconfiguration of global supply chains.
Right. The U.S. is utilizing intense tech export controls, specifically targeting advanced semiconductors and AI capabilities.
And in response, China is leveraging its dominance in rare earths and critical minerals. This is where geoeconomics dictates national security.
So the U.S. strategy is essentially dual track.
Exactly. Diplomatically, they maintain the guardrails of managed competition with Beijing. But militarily and strategically, they are tightening a web of minilateral alliances across the Indo-Pacific to serve as deterrents.
Which is why we see the elevation of the Quad, involving the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, focusing heavily on maritime security and supply chain resilience.
Yes, and it's also the logic behind AUKUS, the Trilateral Security Pact, equipping Australia with nuclear-powered submarines.
Okay, so I want you to put yourself in the position of a developing or middle power nation right now. The U.S. and China are setting up these nuclear guardrails exclusively for themselves while simultaneously weaponizing their economies.
It's a terrifying position to be in.
Truly, if you are sitting on the economic fault lines of this managed competition, you are incredibly vulnerable to secondary sanctions, technology embargoes, and wild supply chain shocks.
Which brings us to the ultimate strategic dilemma of this era.
Right. How does a massive emerging power like India navigate a world where the rules have been replaced by $1 billion entry fee?
India's positioning in this fragmented order is incredibly delicate, and it starts with a stark security calculation. The danger of U.S.-China managed competition is that if tensions ease in the Pacific, if Beijing feels diplomatically and militarily secure on its eastern maritime flank, well, it frees up the People's Liberation Army.
To reallocate resources to its continental periphery.
Exactly, meaning the line of actual control, the LAC.
So if the U.S. and China call a temporary truce in the South China Sea, India actually faces heightened pressure on its Himalayan borders.
Precisely. That is the mechanism India's defense establishment is preparing for. A great power détente often leaves middle powers exposed.
So India has to dramatically accelerate its border deterrence.
Yes. And this isn't just about troop deployments. It requires sustained force modernization, advanced surveillance logistics, and tri-service integration. India has to ensure China doesn't exploit this period of managed competition to alter the status quo along the LAC.
And that military vulnerability is inextricably linked to economic vulnerability, isn't it?
Completely. Because the global trading system is fracturing. Because the WTO is being sidelined by U.S. tariffs and Chinese state subsidies, India cannot rely on the old models of globalization.
Which brings us to the structural necessity behind Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliance. It isn't merely a political slogan about domestic manufacturing for them.
No, it is a desperate geopolitical survival strategy. To survive the weaponization of supply chains, India basically has to become an indispensable node in the global economy.
They have to improve regulatory predictability to attract the capital that is currently fleeing China.
More importantly, they must scale domestic capabilities in hypercritical sectors. I mean, think about it. If you rely entirely on Taiwan or the US for semiconductors, or on China for the rare earths needed for clean tech and electric vehicles, you have zero strategic autonomy.
You are completely beholden to their export controls.
Exactly. Mastering these technologies shifts India from being a dependent market to a crucial link that other major powers simply cannot afford to alienate.
So geopolitics dictates the economic reality, which in turn forces domestic technological acceleration. But how does this play out diplomatically? I mean, India is navigating a fiercely transactional U.S. on one side and an expansionist China on the other.
It's a very tightrope.
Like, they chose to be a mere observer at the Board of Peace, avoiding that billion-dollar buy-in. How do they balance this without getting crushed between the two blocs?
The mechanism here is strategic autonomy, which they execute through multi-line diplomacy. In a multipolar world where the traditional superpower refuses to play by universal rules, permanent, treaty-bound alliances are actually a liability.
So India pursues issue-based coalitions instead.
Yes, they participate in the Quad alongside the U.S. to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific and counter Chinese maritime dominance.
But simultaneously, they maintain pragmatic, functional engagement with Beijing to manage the border crisis.
Right, and they heavily rely on platforms like BRICS to champion the interests of the global south. They are expanding regional networking with ASEAN, deepening energy and diaspora ties in West Asia, and engaging with Africa.
It is a brilliantly calculated strategy of engaging with everyone while relying on no one exclusively.
It is the ultimate tightrope walk. The core of India's strategy is not about choosing the American bloc or the Chinese bloc. It is about building enough domestic leverage.
Economically, through tech manufacturing, and militarily at the LAC.
Exactly. Building that leverage so that they are never forced into a position where they have to choose a side.
Incredible. Okay, let's do a rapid revision of everything we've covered today. If we connect all these threads, the trajectory of the global order becomes undeniable.
Yeah, so to recap the cause-effect chain for you, the domestic ideological shift of the Magie movement essentially dismantled American faith in traditional multilateralism.
Right, and that ideological shift operationalized a highly transactional, tariff-heavy foreign policy that deliberately bypassed institutions like the WTO and the UN.
Which created a massive vacuum. This vacuum necessitated the creation of exclusive minilateral structures like the Board of Peace, which, as we saw, replace international law with billion-dollar entry fees.
And because the U.S. is entirely focused on managing its economic and technological competition with China, the rest of the world, particularly nations like India, must adapt.
They have to double down on strategic autonomy, aggressive border deterrence, and indigenous tech development just to survive the fallout of a multipolar world.
We started this deep dive by talking about the bouncer at the door of global diplomacy, charging $1 billion for a seat at the table. The rules-based order isn't just pausing, it is being actively dismantled and sold for parts.
It's a whole new world.
It really is. So, as you process the reality of this, a fragmented, hyper-transactional system, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. If the future of global stability is increasingly dictated by exclusive pay-to-play coalitions, how long can emerging powers maintain true strategic autonomy before the economic pressure forces them to either buy a seat at the table or be left completely out in the cold?